Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and today I'm making a miniature craft room. Now, technically I already have a craft room in my dollhouse. Well, if you consider putting a Barbie sewing set into a room as having a craft room. That also apparently doubles as the laundry room. Yeah, I think it's time for a makeover. Now, the room that I just showed you is the only space I have to put this, and it's a very small space, so whatever I'm making is going to have to fit in there very snugly. And what I want to do is a cabinet along that long wall with shelves above it, and then have a desk on that short wall all the way in the back. And I want to make it all in one piece. To me, I think of it as kind of like a built-in look. Now that the rough idea is out of the way, a few disclaimers for anybody who's watching this looking for a tutorial. I do give the measurements that I used, but this is very customized to my space, which you'll see in a minute. And what I also did, and what I think is more important, is I tried to give how I came to those measurements, like how I picked them, because I want you to be able to take this idea and make it to fit your space and not have to rely on my measurements. And of course, friendly reminder, hot glue is hot and knives and scissors are sharp. So I started out by cutting out all of the pieces for the lower half of this project, so for the cabinets and the desk. I am using foam board from Dollar Tree for this, and the first thing I cut out was the wall where the cabinets and the shelves will go. So to get that measurement, I measured the length of the wall in my space, as well as the height. And then I cut mine out 15 by 12.5 inches. And for the height, I actually took half an inch off of my measurement because I wanted to be able to get this in and out of the room pretty easily. Next, I needed a template of the floor. My room has angles in the back, and I think the shape is supposed to mimic like a bay window, but I needed to know those angles, so I used the very professional tool of a piece of paper that I slid in and then just creased the paper to mark those angles. Now, if your walls are straight with no angles, which is what I would have preferred had I not been trying to get this fit into the room so closely, I would just take a piece of paper with the length and width that I wanted my finished project to be. So I took the wall and placed it onto my pattern on the side where the wall will sit in the room, and marked the thickness of the wall, and then trimmed that piece off. Then I decided how deep I wanted the desk and cabinets to be. I based this off of my playset and ended up with 2.5 inches. So I lined the ruler up with that long edge that I just trimmed at 2.5 inches and marked, and then marked 2.5 inches from the edge with the angles on the short side and marked that as well. I then trimmed off the excess paper in the middle, giving me an L-shaped pattern. Use this paper as a pattern to cut out 2 pieces from foam board, and leave one all-in-one piece for the counter and desk top. And then for the other one, I separate the desk from the cabinet end. And so the long strip that goes to the cabinet will be the floor, and the other piece will be used as a shelf under the desk, so I set that aside for later. Next, I cut out the cabinet side pieces, so the width of these pieces is the same as the width of the countertop, so 2.5 inches in my case. And the height, I determined how tall I wanted the countertop to be, and then subtracted out the thickness of 2 pieces of foam board. For me, that ended up being about 5 1/8 inches, and I cut out 3 of these. Now, on the end of the cabinet closest to the entrance of my room, I want to add a fold-out cutting table. So I cut a piece of foam board 4 inches wide by 5 inches long. Now, the length of this can't be more than the height of the cabinet side pieces, and I suppose the width could be bigger, but more than 4 inches seems like a bit much, so for this I am just going to give the exact measurements. So take a piece of cardstock that's 4 by 2 inches and fold it in half so that it's 4 by 1 inch. Glue one side of the cardstock to the bottom of the cutting table piece on that 4-inch side. Then line it up with the edge of the countertop and glue the other side to the bottom of the counter to create a hinge. Now we need a table leg to hold the extension up. So I cut this 1/4 inch smaller than the width of the cutting table, so 3 3/4 inches. And then for the height, take the finished height of the counter and subtract the thickness of one piece of foam board. I ended up with 5 3/8 of an inch. Make a hinge the same as before, but this time make it a little shorter than the height of the cutting board table leg, and only glue it to the leg for now. For this to work, the table leg needs to fit under the countertop. So I cut a notch out of the floor 1/4 by 4 inches. And I also trimmed down the width of one of the cabinet side pieces by 1/4 inch. And you might be able to see now why I cut everything out first and then assemble second, because so many things the measurements build on top of each other, and it's easier if they're still separate to figure that out. The last thing to cut out, for now at least, is the shelf for the other end of the cabinet. So I measure the floor from the end of the notch all the way to that back edge, and then subtract out the thickness of 2 pieces of foam board. For me, that was about 8 1/4 inches for the length, and then the width is just matched to the width of the countertop, which is 2 1/2 inches. Okay, I know I just threw a bunch of measurements at you, but this really is how I do my projects and kind of how my mind works, I guess. So this is how it makes sense for me both to do it and to explain it. But now we can start assembling the cabinets and basically like the lower half of this project. So start by gluing the floor to the wall. Then glue the trimmed down cabinet side piece into that corner where the notch is cut. Glue another side piece on the other end of that notch. Then draw a line on the back wall to mark the placement for the cabinet shelf. Glue in the shelf, and then glue the final cabinet side on. And this is where I made a mistake that I didn't catch until I finished this. I glued that last side piece beside the floor instead of on top of the floor like the other two. It's a small mistake, but one that does affect a couple of things, including the fact that it makes that counter on that end sit a little lower than on the other end. And in miniatures like this, 1/4 inch kind of makes a big difference in the end. Glue the countertop to the cabinet sides and the back wall, and then attach the other half of the table leg hinge to the cabinet side that sits under the cutting table. Now the other end of the desk does need something to support it, so I cut a table leg for that other short end, which needs to be the width of that end, which for me, because of that funny angle I'm working with, is only 1 1/4 inch. And then the height is the same as the cutting table leg, which is the counter height minus the thickness of one piece of foam board. And so I glue that leg to the desk, and then I take that desk shelf piece, that piece that I cut off earlier, and I trim off the thickness of a piece of foam board off of the short end that's going to attach to the desk leg. And because I glued that cabinet side piece in the wrong spot earlier, I also had to cut off a notch from the front edge of the desk. I then cut 1/2 inch strips of foam board that I glued under the desk to act as spacers so that I could glue the desk shelf on straight. And then I had to rip the desk leg off because I realized that I had glued it on wrong. So I took that off and put it back on the correct way. And then I realized that the desk leg was too tall and I had to trim it down. Now at the time I thought that was because I had cut the piece too long, but now I think it was actually because I had glued that cabinet in the wrong spot, the cabinet side piece in the wrong spot, and that caused everything to, like I said earlier, sit a bit shorter than it should have. So at this point, I have the entire bottom half done, and I stuck it in the room to make sure it fit before starting on the top half. For the top half, I wanted a tall, narrow shelf on either end, and then one long shelf running along the top in between them. And then the middle of it, I was just going to leave open. So the first thing I cut out is the top of the shelves. This needs to be the length of the wall, 15 inches. By however deep I wanted the shelves to be, I chose 1¼ inch. For the shelf sides, I measured from the top of the wall down to the top of the counter and then subtracted out the thickness of a piece of foam board. And then the width was the depth of the shelves again. So in my case, I ended up with 6½ by 1¼ inches, and I cut 4 of these. For the tall shelves, I wanted them to be 2 inches wide and then, of course, 1¼ inch deep. And I cut 6 of these initially, but that's because I miscalculated how many I was going to need. I ended up only needing 4, 2 for either shelf. For the long shelf in the middle, this took a little more calculating. I took the length of the shelf minus the thickness of 4 pieces of foam board and then minus the width of the 2 shelves, giving me a length of 10¼ inches, though it probably should have been closer to 10⅛. So I start by gluing a shelf side into the front corner edge. I then attached the shelves. I found it easier to mark the placement of the shelf first so that I could glue it relatively level, and then attach the second shelf side. I then marked and attached the middle shelf, and I added 1/2-inch strips of foam board underneath it for more support, as well as, again, just to make sure I get it straight, or at least somewhat straight. I then attached the second tall shelf the same way as the first. I did have to trim down the width of these shelves just a little bit because, like I said earlier, that middle shelf probably should have been a little shorter, and evidently I had either measured wrong or cut wrong. And then finally attach the top. And with it attached is where it becomes a little more obvious that something was off, because while the top of the shelf is even with the top of the wall on one side, it is about 1/4 inch shorter on the other end. So here's the finished unit, and now it's time to add all of the accessories. I've been accumulating a lot of stuff since I started planning this project. I got small, clear containers from Dollar Tree because I didn't want to just have containers that I couldn't see into, because then I might as well just stick labels on them and leave them empty, and no one will really know, and what's the fun in that? Now, a lot of the miniatures are made from following tutorials from other channels on YouTube. If you just search DIY doll craft room, you'll probably find them if you haven't heard of them already. But a couple of them I did make tutorials for, but I didn't want to shove them into this video, and there's just not enough to make a separate video. So I've made a few shorts showing how I made them, and hopefully they released today along with this video. Okay, so now let's look at what I put in there. So we have sewing patterns and scrapbook paper in magazine holders, a mini version of my favorite pattern book, some embroidery floss, seed beads from Dollar Tree, paint tubes and brushes, a jar of markers and another one of pencils, liquid glue, both school and tacky glue, scissors and a cutting mat, zippers, a bulletin board, mini buttons and belt buckles, popsicle sticks, a stack of fabric, a container of drawing supplies and a paper cutter, another container of yarn, some mini spools from a sewing kit, an iron, knitting needles and an embroidery hoop, and who doesn't have a container of random stuff in the craft room? A leaving loom, a tray for under the desk, a small crochet basket for a trash can, an ironing board and yardstick, a bag of stuffing, and I didn't get around to making a chair, so I just pulled one from another room. Thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next week for another handmade happening.